Hi folks, and welcome to the Is It Worth It for the AC4 Experimental, a Tier 6 British Premium Medium tank, although technically it's Australian. We'll get into that in a moment. Let's get on to the history. Now, the AC4 Experimental is the Australian cruiser version 4 experimental because it was a prototype, just one was ever built. Now, I'd love to get into all the history of the AC1, but that's being saved for another review. But basically, in a nutshell, in 1941, after Dunkirk and the British had left most of their armour on the beaches at Dunkirk, they were very, very short of armour. So they had to approach the Commonwealth countries and they basically started working on new designs for new tanks. Now, that led to the development of the Ram 2 in Canada, but in Australia, it was the AC1 Sentinel. So it was designed to be a cruiser. Now, the AC1 was produced, it was actually manufactured between 1942 and 1943, but we'll get into all of that in the history. The AC2 was a Sentinel with a 6-pounder. The AC3 was developed in 1943, which was basically a Sentinel with a 25-pounder howitzer, short-barreled howitzer, which isn't in-game yet. It isn't in-game. I would really be interested in the AC3 appearing in-game because, you know, I love my derp tanks. But basically, by mid-1943, work also began because all the previous tanks used 2-pounders or 6-pounders or howitzers. They weren't competitive against German armour, and as a result there was a rushed project to try and get a tank with a 17-pounder. You know, that led to the development of the Challenger, it led to the development of the Sherman Firefly, and the Australian cruiser was basically designed to carry a 17-pounder too, the AC4. So in July 1943 the prototype was built, a Sentinel with a 17-pounder, but in order to mount the 17-pounder, the turret had to be enlarged, so it needed a much bigger turret for the 17-pounder. That made it a big, huge difference, or one of the biggest differences over the Sentinel, the AC1. But because of the bigger turret, it also needed a bigger hull. So the tank, even though it does look like a Sentinel, if you were to look at these two tanks side by side, you'd notice that this tank is significantly bigger. So just as the prototype was built, however, along came the Sherman Firefly, which was cheaper to produce, also had a 17-pounder, so the AC4 was scrapped. It basically, as I say, never made it past prototype stage, just one was ever built, but we have the pleasure of playing it in-game, so that's pretty much it for the history. It is a larger Sentinel with a 17-pounder. So popping into Tanks GG to do a quick side-by-side comparison, and I'm not going to include all the tanks up here. I'm not going to include all the Tier 6 Premium Mediums because, a lot of these tanks up here are up here for a reason. Whether it's a similar armor profile to the AC4, whether it's similar gun performance to the AC4, whether or not a similar mobility to the AC4, but you'll notice tanks like the STRV aren't here because the STRV is an autoloader and it's a completely different style of play. But I have put some of the premium Tier 6 Premium Mediums up here, and I've also included the Firefly because basically, just like real life, the Firefly meant that the AC4 wasn't, developed further than prototype, but, it's got the same gun and it's got similar mobility and armor. So, I think these are good comparisons when we're looking at how the AC4 plays. If you've played any of the tanks up here, you're going to know or get a little bit of a better idea of how the AC4 is. And I think the AC4 is a little bit of a surprise package because this tank actually gets quite a lot of criticism. I've seen a lot of other people criticize this tank for things that really shouldn't be criticized. There are some things about this tank that get criticized that I don't think are weaknesses. I don't think they're bad, but, we'll get into that in a moment. But first of all, we're going to start with the DPM, and you can see that the DPM is around about 1900, just short of 1900. And so, the DPM, yes, it's on the low side for a Tier 6 Premium Medium. You can see that the Schmal term is slightly worse, but not by much. And, most of the other tanks have it beaten. But when you consider that, you can get crew skills, equipment, consumables, you can boost this DPM, and it's almost 1900, so it's not that much worse than the other tanks up here. So while the DPM is not amazing on the tank, as a Tier 6 it's actually okay and it's quite competitive with the others. They don't have the DPM beaten by much, so I don't think the DPM is a weakness for this tank at all. What we do have is very, very good penetration because it's a 17-pounder, so you get 171 millimeters of penetration with your standard AP at Tier 6. And that is incredibly good. You can see it's got all the other tanks beaten. It's joint penetration with the Firefly because it's the same gun. So the penetration, big positive. It means that the AC4 can deal with Tier well, pretty much any lower tier tank. It can deal with any similar tier tank. It can damage tier 7s with no problems, and it can handle even some tier 8s. So I think the penetration is a big positive for this tank, and the alpha damage is something I've seen people criticize the tank for, because, the 17 pounder is a gun that's used on a lot of tanks in the game, and it's usually, the low alpha damage. People talk about the 17 pounder having low alpha damage. For a tier 7, maybe it has low alpha damage. The Challenger has low alpha damage for a TD at tier 7. The AT-15A has low alpha damage for a TD. They use the 17 pounder, but you got to remember this is a tier 6, and I like putting things into context. So while I've seen some reviews criticize the AC4 for having low alpha damage, it doesn't, because what you can see here is you get 150 alpha damage, and when you compare that to the other tanks, similar tanks, it's got better alpha damage than most of the other tier 6 premium mediums. The one exception being the Skoda T40, which gets 220 alpha, but 150 actually beats the Fury. It beats the small term. It beats the Cromwell B. So 150 alpha damage, even though a lot of reviews have said it's a negative, is actually a positive. It's actually quite good for a tier 6 medium. So I think alpha damage is actually a strength for the AC4. Next we come down to rate of fire and reload, and again you'll see that it comes pretty much bottom of the heap with the exception of the T40, but once again it's all linked to the DPM. I mean, 1251 DPR rate of fire is not that much slower than 13.3. You're not going to notice that big a difference, and reload time obviously 4.79 is not that big a difference to 4.51, so you're not going to notice that big a difference with the handling and the rate of fire compared to, or between the AC4 and the Firefly. Another strength for the tank is the shell velocity, which comes in at 884, and again, when you compare it to the other tanks, it's much better with the exception of the small term. So the shell velocity is very good. It's better than most of the other tier 6 premium mediums, so it's not terrible, and it means you can hit tanks at distance without having to give them too much lead. Moving on, we've got the weapons handling. Now this is a surprise package again, because I love the 17 pounder, but the 17 pounder handling, the gun handling is not quite as good on the AC4 as I was expecting. We'll get to the aim time. You can see that the aim time has got the best aim time. Another strength for the tank. 2.01 matches the Firefly, so very good aim time. But this is the thing that really surprised me. 0.37 accuracy. Now it's 0.37 here, but it's actually 0.39 in the garage. So 0.39 accuracy is basically 0.4. So this accuracy is closer to Russian accuracy than it is to, what you would expect British accuracy to be or German accuracy to be. It's got a very inaccurate gun, which was a big surprise. You can see that the accuracy is worse than most of the tanks up here, with the exception of the Fury. Yeah, that was a bit of a letdown. The Fury, or the Firefly actually has better accuracy slightly. But while the accuracy may not be good, some of the other stats are. You can see that the gun dispersion, firing on the move, is actually okay. It's better than most of the tanks up here. Tank traverse, again, shooting while moving your tank or turning your tank. Again, it's better than most of the tanks up here, with the exception of the Fury. After firing, you can see that the accuracy, or turret traverse, is better than most of the tanks up here. After firing, it's better than most of the tanks up here. So yeah, the gun handling seems to be very good, but it all comes down to that accuracy. Unfortunately, good aim time, good gun handling, but poor accuracy. The elevation seems pretty standard at 20 degrees. The gun depression is amazing at 10 degrees. Now, one of the things when I was driving the Firefly and grinding through the Firefly was I wished the tank had better gun depression. You can see that the AC4 Experimental's got a whole 10 degrees of gun depression, which is better than most of the tanks up here, with the exception of the Fury. So gun depression, another big bonus for the AC4 Experimental. When it comes to movement, then unfortunately we come to some big negatives, because while 60 kilometers an hour is a very good top speed, in fact only the Cromwell B has it beaten, don't expect this performance at all. The reverse speed, 20 kilometers an hour, again, very good. It's got the best reverse speed, joint best with the Skoda and the Cromwell B, but yeah, again, that's not as good as advertised, because it all comes down to the engine. You only get a 330 horsepower engine, and that means it's incredibly underpowered, especially when you compare it to some of the other tanks up here. Only the Schmolterm has got worse horsepower to weight ratio, or worse engine, than the AC4 Experimental has. The power to weight ratio is only 11.7. Now that is terrible. You can see it is significantly worse than any of the other tanks up here, with the exception of the small term. So the power to weight ratio, the horsepower of the engine, means that that top speed is never ever going to be reached unless you're going down a very, very steep hill. This is something that's really going to hurt the tank, especially when you're taking it on slopes, especially when you're trying to go uphill to use that 10 degrees of gun depression. The tank will struggle uphill. It can be slower than a tog sometimes going uphill. It can be slow to reverse back down. It takes a while to build up speed. So the power to weight ratio is a negative. And one of the things that really surprised me again about the AC4 Experimental is usually wargaming buff tanks that, don't have particularly strong engines. They usually give them quite good terrain resistance because, terrain resistance is a hidden stat, and it's a good way of buffing a tank that historically didn't get a very powerful engine and making it competitive. But for the AC4, they didn't. The terrain resistance is awful. So not only is it very, very underpowered regarding horsepower to weight ratio and a very underpowered engine, it also has pretty bad ground resistance. It's worse than any of the tanks up here. So the ground resistance is not very good, and when you compare poor ground resistance with poor horsepower to weight ratio, you're going to have a very, very sluggish tank. Now, having said that, the traverse speed, the turret traverse speed, is extremely good at just about 46 degrees per second. Incredibly good, better than any of the tanks up here with the exception of the Cromwell B. And just remember, it's also got better shooting on the move, or shooting while turning the turret, than most of the other tanks as well. So turret traverse is definitely a strength. The tank traverse is okay, again 40 degrees per second, but once again, even though it gets 40 degrees per second, which is, pretty comparable to some of the tanks up here, not quite as good as others, it's pretty average, slightly better than others, you've got that poor horsepower to weight ratio. So, it's going to actually, you're not going to be accelerating pretty fast. It's not going to be turning as fast as advertised. It can turn at 40 degrees, but that poor horsepower to weight ratio doesn't make it a maneuverable tank. So, it's not quite as good as advertised. So this movement, this horsepower to weight ratio, really, really, really hurts the tank, unfortunately. Now, another surprise package for the AC4 Experimental. Again, this tank gets criticized for its armor. When you see reviews, they'll say this tank has no armor. Now, while I agree the armor is not great, and considering this tank sees tier 7s and it sees tier 8s, the armor definitely isn't good, but very few tier 6 premium mediums, or very few tier 6 tanks actually have good armor against higher tier tanks. So even though the armor gets criticized, you can see that the hull armor is 65 on front, 45 on the side, 45 in the rear, and that actually makes it very competitive. It means it's got better hull armor than the Sherman Firefly by a significant margin. It's got better hull armor than the Fury by a significant margin. It's got better side and rear armor than the Schmalterm. The Schmalterm beats it slightly on front by 15 millimeters, but it's got better side and rear armor than the Schmalterm does. It's got better armor front, side and rear than the Skoda T40 does. It's got better armor front, side and rear than the Cromwell B does. So, the hull armor, while not amazing against higher tier tanks, is actually very, very competitive. It's as good as most tier 6 mediums are, so I really think it's unfair when you criticize the armor. I hear the armor on the AC4 Experimental getting criticized because it's pretty standard for a tier 6. Yes, very few tier 6s are going to be able to bounce tier 8s, but the AC4 is no different, and the AC4 has a better chance of bouncing a tier 8 than a lot of the other tanks do. So I think the hull armor is very, very competitive. Not great, but it's competitive to most of the other tier 6 mediums. Now, the turret armor, there's a small problem in Tanks GG in that the turret armor shows up as 0 for side turret armor, and that means that all the other tanks are green here, but it's got 65 millimeters of turret armor all round. So again, turret armor better than advertised. It's actually got better turret armor than the Fury all round. It's got better turret armor than the Skoda T40 all round, but this turret armor is not amazing. The Firefly's got it beaten from the front, Schmalterm's got it well beaten from the front, and the Cromwell B actually has more frontal turret armor, even though it's got no frontal turret armor. The Cromwell B actually has better frontal turret armor than the AC4 Experimental. So while the turret armor is not great, I would call it average. It's better than some, not as good as others. Next major thing is the view range, which is a little bit of a disappointment because most of the other tanks have it beaten 370 seems to be about the main view range for a tier 6 medium. Only the Cromwell B has the view range matched at 360. So this is a tank that really needs optics, really needs a good crew, really needs optics of some sort on it, because it's going to find it more difficult to spot its own targets than other tier 6 medium tanks do. So yeah, view range not amazing. The radio range, the signal range is actually really, really bad on the tank. It's got the worst signal range of any of the tanks up here by a significant margin. But overall, I think that the tank is a little bit of a surprise package because it gets criticized for its armor. I think the armor is actually quite good for a tier 6 medium, especially when you put it into context against other tier 6 mediums. The gun, again, amazing penetration, good alpha, even though the alpha gets criticized. I think the alpha is quite good. The gun handling, absolutely amazing. The aim time is great, but the accuracy lets the gun down, or lets the tank down overall. I think the DPM, even though it's not, on paper the DPM is not amazing, is actually quite competitive. It's not quite as good as the others, but it can be made good. It's almost, it's very, very close to being very, very competitive to all the others, and something you're not really going to notice. So I think the tank overall is a little bit of a surprise package. About the only major negative for the AC4 is that false top speed and false reverse speed. 60 kilometers an hour is a dream. Unfortunately, it comes with a very underpowered engine. It's got terrible horsepower to weight ratio, and as a result it affects the mobility of the tank hugely, especially compared to any of the other tanks up here. So let's take a closer look at the armor profile, because as we know, the stats in the garage never tell the whole story, or very rarely do, but in this case it does, because mostly, at least, it does, because this is a tank that has 65mm on the front of the hull, 65mm on the turret all round, and what you can see here is there are many areas on the front of the tank that are 65. In fact, what you think are weak spots, this is where the large strangely shaped machine gun is, it's not a weak spot. The viewport here is not a weak spot. So what you can see is basically what you think are weak spots are actually the strongest armor on the tank, on the front of the hull at least. The lower glacis, which is quite flat, is 65. Viewport here is 65. The machine gun is 66. So yep, strongest armor on the front of the hull seem to be what are usually weak spots. The upper glacis is angled, so it's only 29, 46, 29, depending on where you hit it. So this is a weak spot that you can pen if you face an AC4, and if you're firing a derp gun, this is where you want to aim if you're aiming at the tank frontally. So even a lower caliber derp gun can get through the upper glacis in places. So yeah, this is a tank where if you see a derp gun, you've got to get out of there, because derp guns can one-hit kill you. The flat area, although it's not quite flat, you can see there is some sloping, some angling going on here. Again, it's not quite 65, it's more like 50mm of frontal armor, but yeah, in the main, it's got a lot of areas 65 on the front of the hull, and worst case scenario, it's about 46, 51, and then very small strip just at the top of the upper glacis that can drop down to around 20, 34, as you can see. The turret, 65mm again all around, and what you can see is around the gun mantlet, it is 65mm, worse if you hit it at an angle. But yeah, most tanks, lower tier tanks, are going to have problems penning this. Upper tier tanks or higher tier tanks, no problems dealing with the turret on the AC4. The gun mantlet, no spaced armor, so even though it's no armor behind it, so it's spaced armor but no armor behind it, and what you can see again is it's roughly about 65mm thick. So there are some areas, depending on the sloping, depending on the rounding, where you actually hit it, but there are areas where you might get a bounce, but in the main, most of the gun mantlet you can pretty much take it as 65, and again, it's only going to be effective against lower tier tanks. So the side of the tank, you've only got 45 on the hull as advertised, and unfortunately the tracks don't cover very much of the hull. So when you're getting shot in the side, it's very unlikely your tracks are actually going to eat any shots, because as you can see, most of the hull is exposed. The tracks are below the hull. So yeah, tracks, even though they are spaced armor, aren't going to do a very good job on this. Try to avoid getting shot in the side. Side of the turret, again, it is advertised as 65. There are strips of 65, but some of the areas gets down to 60, 58, 59. So yep, okay, turret armor seems to be quite well armored. The rear of the turret, 65 as advertised, and then the rear of the tank, 28, 29mm on the engine deck, and then the back of the tank is only 45 with a stronger point here of 55. So yeah, this tank doesn't like derp guns, it doesn't like KV2s, it doesn't like a lot of tanks firing HE. And there is also something I need to mention here is while the side armor is okay and it, you are encouraged to maybe side scrape in it, there are a couple of weak spots at the rear of the tank. So you can see that side scraping, you can get your armor up to about 80mm. Again, effective against lower tier tanks, not going to do much against similar tier, higher tier tanks, but you've got these wings here, as you can see, and when you're side scraping, sometimes these are going to be not quite as effective. You've got 86 here, but someone aims towards the rear of the tank, they can hit flat armor back here that's only 65. It's there on both sides. So side scraping, it is viable, but if someone knows what they're doing, they are going to be able to pen you here. So yeah, just something to be aware of. One other thing to be aware of is it's got a very, very central mounted turret. This is one of the last parts I'm recording for the review, so I forgot to mention it during the rest of the review. But one thing you've got to do is avoid going around corners, straight around corners. As you can see, center mounted turret, that means that you expose a huge amount of your tank. Before you get around a corner. So enemy tanks are going to be able to track you, they're going to be able to shoot your hull long before you can get your gun on target because it's centralized. Same with the rear of the tank. If you're reverse side scraping or reversing around a corner, they're going to be able to shoot a huge amount of your tank before you can get your gun on target. So just be aware of that when you're using it in city fights. Just driving around corners can be extremely dangerous, especially if it's a rapid firing gun. They're going to track you and they're going to keep you perma-tracked. So big weak spot big weakness for the tank that I keep on forgetting to mention, but it was one of the things I discovered in my early game. So this is not a tank that deals with corners particularly well. Okay folks, let's check out this gun in action. We are here on Muravanka. Yep, it's a tier 8 game, so I'm a tier 6 tier 8 game, bottom tier. One RT in play, lots and lots of tier 8s, tier 7s, so good test for the tank. And already you can see the mobility, it's struggling to get above 35 kilometers an hour. And this is where the 60 kilometers an hour top speed is just fiction. It's nonsense. So we're going to be playing a support role. Even when you're top tier in the AC4, you should be playing more of a support role. This is not a brawler. It's not a frontline tank. And we hit the hill, and you can see just how much this tank struggles down to 8 kilometers an hour trying to crest the hill. So yeah, the engine power, big negative for this tank, but we're going to play a support role. We're going to stay back, we're going to hang in these trees, or in the bushes, look for shots. You can see that the turret traverse is quite good, and the aim time is okay. And I misjudged that. Got the outline, shot a house, so shot went pretty much where I aimed, and it's just very difficult to track a moving target. But we get him, we get one shot in, and somehow it gets spotted. I have no idea. Let me increase the size of the minimap. No idea how I got spotted. This tank has very good camo rating, but unfortunately it let me down there. But you can see that the reverse speed is quite good. And then just trying to climb back up to the top of the hill. Once again, we get lack of engine power. So basically, in this replay, I'm not going to be aggressive at all, but you can see that the gun is a little bit derpy. Miss a shot on the M4. Get another one in, and someone takes him out. So there is, I can't remember, it's been a while since I watched the replay, but there's a point where you're going to see a series of shots at a stationary target where very few of the shots actually go where I aim. Cromwell B, look at the aim time, is okay. And we managed to sneak a shot into his turret as he's reversing away. Now, I haven't been spotted again. I have not been spotted ever since that initial spot in the bush. I still am shooting from stealth. I have not been spotted. But T-34 in the distance. See, the aim time is okay. The accuracy was okay there. And yep, just shooting tier 8s here, and that shot doesn't even reach the target. So a little bit of misbehavior, but 3 out of 4 isn't bad. And we managed to set him on fire, take him out. So there is a tier 8 tank dead. And as I say, this tank, tier 6 tank, the gun is good enough to deal with a lot of tier 8s. So we're doing okay in the middle. Unfortunately, the other flank is looking under pressure. And now a Jagdpanther has taken out the SP-1C, so we know there's a Jagdpanther. Oh, he's on the minimap. We're just going to see if one of our team can spot him, but once again, I'm out of render range from the Jagdpanther. Oh, there he is. Now watch these shots. I should have gone for the CDC maybe, but that shot hits the ground. That shot goes way to the left. That shot goes high, at least a meter above where I was aiming, hit his gun mantlet. That shot goes low, lands in front of the tank. And we finally get one into his lower glacis. You can see that the rate of fire is good. That shot goes way to the right, but ends up hitting the target anyway. That goes down to the left, so not one of these 7 shots I've fired, look, high to the right. Not one of these 8 shots I've fired now is actually, there's the first one that's actually gone near the reticule. That one goes high again. So, yeah, the gun, long distance, it's a decent sniper, but unfortunately the gun can sometimes let you down. But you can see the turret traverse, very, very quick, able to swing around, take out the, or put a shot into the TVP. Beyond finishes them off, and once again, shooting a tier 7 heavy, side of a tier 7 heavy, and we're able to get a blind kill there. So, second kill, and just remember, I'm up to 2k damage, and I'm a tier 6 in a tier 8 game, so now that the enemy team are starting to collapse, there's only 4 of them left, we're able to move up, spot a T69, and shooting down at them, get one shot in, and another shot in, gonna go for the killing shot, and for some reason we bounce. And then our team unfortunately cap out for absolutely no reason. So just a first class in that game, you got to see the weak engine power, how much it struggles to get uphill or struggles to reach any speed faster than about 35 kilometers an hour. But more importantly, you got to see the gun. You got to see the decent penetration, being able to deal as bottom tier with tier 8 tanks and being able to pen them without having to resort to premium ammo. You got to see the decent penetration over distance, the decent aim time, the quick turret traverse, but you also got to see, unfortunately, the accuracy, and the accuracy let me down. Even though we had a decent game, you saw a lot of those shots weren't going anywhere near the center of the reticule. They were planting at the edges of the reticule. You know, we fired 9 shots at a Jagdpanther. We penned him maybe 3, possibly 4 times, but unfortunately, you know, even when we did pen them, out of 9 shots, only 1 shot actually went where I aimed. They were going wide, they were going high, they were hitting his gun mantlet, they were hitting the edge of his tank and bouncing when I was aiming center mass. So the accuracy is something that will let you down, because it's closer to Russian accuracy than it is to German accuracy, much, much closer. But yeah, bottom tier in a tier 8 game, and I was playing quite passively. I was playing as a support. I think that's how you need to play the tank, and then you can do a job even in tier 8 games. Even when you're top tier in a tier 6 game, I think you need to play the tank this way, because it's not a brawler, and if you're on the front line and enemy tanks are spotting you, they're going to take you out very, very easily. But as I say, bottom tier, finished top on damage, 2,456, and we finished top on XP with 1068. So this is a tank, when it's played to its strengths, when it uses its gun depression, when it uses its penetration, when it uses its camo rating, which is incredibly good. I think we were only spotted once, possibly twice in that entire game. When it's used to its strengths, then it can do a job, even in tier 8 games. So it was quite a good result, and you know, it's not a bad money maker either. So 28 shots fired, 21 hits. We damaged 8, destroyed 2, and we earned 48,000 credits with a premium account, which isn't too bad for a tier 6 premium. It's not going to earn money like a tier 8 premium does, but that's not too bad for a tier 6. So yeah, I was quite impressed. I mean, once you embrace the tank and basically stop trying to play it like a medium and stop cursing its lack of engine power, then I think the tank can do a job even when it's bottom tier. So let's talk about crew, and is the AC4 Experimental a good crew trainer? Well, it comes with a commander, a gunner, a driver, a radio operator, and a loader. That seems to be pretty balanced, but yeah, let's have a look at the tech tree. So we come in here, and unlike most nations, the British medium tanks start at tier 1. So when we come to tier 1, we've got a commander, gunner, driver, radio operator, and loader. Okay, perfect. It's very rare I get to say a premium tank is a perfect crew trainer for a tier 1, but the AC4 is, and the medium 3, or medium 2 should be exactly the same. Yes, it is. Perfect crew trainer for tier 1, tier 2. Medium 3 is a little bit of an awkward tank because you actually require 2 radio operators, but you are going to train up the entire crew with the exception of 1 radio operator in the Vickers Mark III. When we come to the Matilda at tier 4, we've got commander, gunner, driver, loader. So we don't need the radio operator, but we can train up an entire Matilda crew in here. The Grant is another medium tank. So we'll have a look at the Grant. We need a commander, 2 gunners, driver, and 2 loaders. So the Grant is a pain in the butt. We can train up 1 commander, gunner, driver, and loader, but we're going to need an extra gunner and an extra loader from somewhere. We don't need the radio operator. So that's really the first tank that isn't a match, with the exception of the medium 3. The Grant leads on to the Sherman 3, which is a perfect match, I believe. Yes, commander, gunner, driver, radio operator, and loader. So perfect crew trainer for the Sherman 3, and the Sherman 3 leads on to the Firefly, which surprisingly, mainly down to the size of the 17-pounder in the turret, only has 4 crew members compared to the Sherman 3, but once again, we don't need the radio operator, but you could train up the rest of a Firefly crew in the AC4, so looking quite good at the moment. And then we move on to TDs down here. We need to move up to the other British medium line, which is the Cromwell, and if you're familiar with the Cromwell and the Comet, you'll see that the crew layout is identical. It's a perfect Cromwell crew trainer. It's a perfect Comet crew trainer as well, because it's the same crew layout: commander, gunner, driver, radio operator, and loader. This is a very good crew trainer. How about the higher tiers? We got the Centurion 1, and we don't have a radio operator. We have a commander, gunner, driver, loader, but we can train up the rest of the crew with the exception of the radio operator. And because these are all Centurions, they should have the same crew layout. Commander, gunner, driver, loader. We could train up the entire 7-1 crew. And the final tank is the Centurion X, and we've got commander, gunner, driver, loader. So, you know, with the exception of a radio operator that doesn't get a workout in some tanks but does in others, you can pretty much train up the rest of the crews in the AC4 experimental. It seems to be an extremely, extremely good crew trainer if you're into British medium tanks. So let's talk about equipment, and thankfully there aren't too many equipment choices. I just need to click the right option. There we go. So this is a tank, as I say, that's best played as a support. Best played as a sniper. It's got incredibly good gun depression, it's got good penetration over distance, and it's got an incredibly good camo rating for a medium tank. So basically, even though the armor is not amazing, it's okay. You just want to avoid getting shot. That's essentially the best defense in this tank. Avoid getting shot. Use your gun depression, use your camo rating, and as a result, I think a lot of my choices for equipment are based on how I think the tank should be played or is best played. So a toolbox, complete waste of time on this tank unless you've got no choice or spare equipment slot and a spare toolbox and a very, very poor crew, but I think there are better pieces of equipment. Filling the tanks with CO2, complete and utter waste of time, because as I say, this tank's best defense is not getting shot. Enhanced gun laying drive is a possibility. I know some people might want to improve the aim time because this tank, unfortunately, it's a negative, doesn't get vert stabs, but on the other hand, the aim time is 2.1 seconds, which is very, very good, and it matches the rate of fire of the gun quite well, so I think there are better pieces of equipment than improving your aim speed by 10%. Coated optics, always a kind of a controversial one when it comes to medium tanks, but in this case I'm quite happy to say that coated optics are not viable, because even though when you're top tier you can play it a little bit more aggressively, even then as top tier, this tank, it just suffers when you try to play it too aggressively. It's a support tank. You're going to be waiting for other tanks to spot enemies for you. You want to shoot tanks from distance, and as a result the coated optics aren't quite, you know, they don't give you as much bang for your buck, I like to say. So it's only going to get you 35 extra meters view range, which will take you up to 385 meters of view range, and that's not great. Other tanks, you're going to be facing tier 7s, you're going to be facing tier 8s, and even with 385 meters of view range, they're going to outspot you with coated optics. So I think the binocs are far more viable, far better piece of equipment for this tank, especially if you play it to its strengths. As I say, keep your distance, snipe from distance, support enemy tanks, use its gun depression, use its camo rating, and in that case I think binocs are far more viable than coated optics, but as always the choice is up to you. Medium caliber gun rammer, absolute must on every single tank because DPM is just so important in this game, so improving your DPM by 10%, absolute must piece of equipment. Medium small liner, again, you know, this tank will take HE damage, it does take a lot of HE damage, but on the other hand, medium small liner is only effective if the HE doesn't penetrate, and if it does penetrate, the small liner is completely useless, so, you know, best defense, don't get shot. So small liner, complete waste of time on this tank. Improving the suspension with coil springs, waste of time on this tank. It's not going to improve your acceleration, it's not going to improve your speed, and this is one area where the tank needs improvement, so no waste of time. Wet ammo rack, again, just like the small liner, the best defense in this tank is not to get shot, so I think there are better pieces of equipment. Improved vents, this is the only one I'm a little bit iffy on. In fact, the last two choices, improved vents and camo, these are interchangeable, I believe. Now, my crew are quite good, or I'm working on a crew to try and get my crew a lot better, but so I've gone for vents because I trust my crew, I have faith in my crew, but you know, if you don't have an amazing crew, then maybe vents are slightly better. You might choose to put vents on the tank, make it roughly about 2.5% better, or the other viable choice instead of vents is a camo net, because as I say, this tank is best played as a sniper, best played as a support enemy, or support friendlies, let them do the spotting and you do the shooting. The camo rating is good, and with a camo net it would be great. So I think if I was pushed, I might actually remove, if I want to spend some gold, which I don't at the moment, but I might be pushed to remove the vents and stick on the camo net, because I think it would improve the tank. But you know, as always, those are my equipment choices. The choice is up to you, but I think the most viable ones are definitely a gun rammer, definitely binocs over coated optics, and then the last choice is either between vents or camo net. It depends on how you play the tank. Okay folks, time for the overview game, a game where I try and show you as many strengths and weaknesses of whatever tank I'm reviewing in one replay. We are here on Abbey. I'm a tier 6 in a tier 6 game, so I'm top tier. Teams look, well, maybe a little bit in our favour. We've got a Unicum and myself on our team, and other than that, the teams look pretty balanced. Dangerous, what is that on the enemy team? There's a dangerous KV... or T150 on the enemy team, but yeah, I was expecting, this game kind of went a little bit strangely because I was expecting a lot more impact from someone with almost 5,000 W and 8, and it just didn't happen. And you'll see towards the end of this game why I picked out this game, but in the meantime, we are just advancing. We're going to be working the 1-2 lines because we had quite a few tanks coming over here, and I figured, you know, even though I do recommend playing this tank more as a support, more as a sniper, unfortunately this map doesn't give you too many opportunities to do that. I mean, I could sit and spawn, which I'm surprised our T67 is doing, and, you know, not have a very big impact on the game until the entire team were dead and the enemy team were rolling into our spawn. Or I can advance and I can try and get some spots, I can try and do a little bit of damage, and as I say, there's a lot of support here, so I move up to help the T25, and then all of a sudden he gets KV2'd. So, yeah, KV2's on a reload, so we're just going to swing out, and what you can see is we've done a little bit of damage. You get one shot into the heavy tank 6, and then I've got to get out of here, because this is the problem with this tank. You've got to plan everything in advance. I've got no support. The tanks that have come over here are collapsing. We've already lost our T25, who sat out in the open in front of a KV2. Our Chihi is on low health. Our Panzer IV-H is on low health. We've already lost a tank down there. What was it? It was an M4. We've got a T1 Heavy. I mean, these guys are collapsing. A lot of enemy tanks here, and once again, I was going to stay, I was going to help, but I've got to get out of here. And you've got to plan so much in advance. You can see the engine struggling, can't get above 30 kilometers an hour. Because we're going slightly uphill, but you've got to run away, and you've got to keep this tank at a distance. You cannot let enemy tanks get close to you, and we're running away. I mean, our team are collapsing, and I've made the right decision, because if I'd hung around there for a couple of shots, I wouldn't have gotten away. These guys are all dead now, and I would have gotten 1 or 2 shots, and it's taken me almost 30 seconds to get from where I was planning to take some shots to here. But we're going downhill. You can see the engine power. We're up to 60 kilometers an hour. And, you know, when you go downhill, it's quite fast. And I'm trying to stay to the flat ground, trying to stay below enemy tanks. I don't want to be spotted. And we still have our T-67 still camping spawn. So, yeah, we've got to keep moving. As you can see, the entire team behind me has collapsed. Lots of enemy tanks moving in. And I've got to get into a position where I can support my team from distance. I can't brawl with these tanks. I can't outmaneuver them. I've simply got to use my slow engine power. You can see how much it's struggling. Anytime there's a rise, anytime it's there's a slope. So there's a T-150 here. Now, I probably play this a little bit badly because I track the T-150 and I get spotted. I should have actually been firing from behind the bush to my left as I'm looking at the tank facing forward, but I get spotted. I hang around till I've dropped off radar. There is RT in this game. So, gotta move, get spotted again. My camo rating isn't working, even though I keep on saying the camo rating's very, very good. So, lots of tanks moving in, T-150s here, but I know that there's a KV-85, a KV-2, VK-3601, Heavy Tank 6. Oh, didn't mean to knock over the T-67, but, okay, here we go. So now, shooting from distance, and my sixth sense hasn't gone off, and there we go. We're just putting shots in. These are at the extreme range. Our binocs have kicked in, and we're just putting shots into this Heavy Tank 6. And we get a nice blind kill. Okay, time to switch to the KV-85. Get one shot in. I reckon that one probably went in. I can't remember. But our team have collapsed. Unfortunately, our team have completely collapsed. And this tank is just not quick enough. I'm trying to keep distance between myself and the enemy team. But if I was in a Cromwell B, I would be around the map. I would be flanking. I would be putting pressure on the tanks on the 8-9 lines. But I can't do that in the AC4 because it's just not quick enough. So all I can do is try and stay at a distance. Try and use my gun depression, as you can see me using here. Try and spot enemy tanks. And it doesn't look as if the enemy team want to advance. Yep, I was waiting for the T-150, but he's not advancing. KV-2 hasn't advanced. The enemy tanks on the 1-2 lines haven't advanced, so I figure I can swing around, excuse me, swing around and support the tanks over on this flank. So there we go. Quick snapshot, miss an easy shot on the T-67, kill his friend moving in. Alright, and I'm constantly keeping an eye on this mini-map. T-67 knows I'm here, he doesn't want to move out, so we can pop out and take a snapshot through a wall at a chaffee. So again, keeping an eye on the mini-map while in between shots, get another shot into the chaffee. Wondering whether I should poke again, and he reverses, I miss. So that shot actually didn't go where I aimed, but it's not the best. The soft stats for this gun for taking snapshots are okay, but I find it's only okay at medium to close range, and there we go, keeping an eye on the minimap, saw the Covenanter trying to flank me, take him out, and now we're moving back, and I'm wondering where the T-150 is, where the KV-2 is. Okay, more tanks, no, he's not here, they're not advancing. So I know there's a chaffee, I know there's RT, I can't really go down the 7 line. I can't go back towards spawn, I'm kind of stuck in this position, and that's the problem with this tank. You're very, very reliant on your team, so spot the KV-2, use my gun depression, use the 20 kilometers an hour reverse speed. I'm able to get back, avoid the KV-2, he's on a reload, take a quick snapshot at a bad angle at the T-150 and miss. Okay, now keeping an eye on the minimap, notice the T-67 is advancing. He's planning to ambush me, but I've got tanks moving up behind me. I've got to go on the attack. I can't hang here any longer. So trying to angle, trying to cause him to bounce. There we go. We've actually managed to bounce a T-67. So unfortunately, I wasn't able to spot tanks moving towards our cap, and we've just taken 2 hits. So there's a VK and a T-34. I'm down to 206 hit points now, and the KV-2 is able to get round behind me and take me out, so I was the last one standing. So, yeah, a defeat, and you might be wondering why I put this game in, and that's because it's the biggest issue or the biggest weakness for this tank I've discovered. It's just that lack of engine power. It's not the gun, it's not the accuracy, it's not the armor, it's the engine power. It means that basically if you're in a position like that game on Abbey where you're basically can't keep distance between yourself and enemy tanks. I mean, it's not like the first game on Muravanka where I was able to sit back and just snipe across a big open map. On this map, I had to play more as a support role, so I went and supported the 1-2 lines, and then my team collapsed, and I had to get out of there. But I had to get out of there while there were still 3 friendlies alive, because I could predict what was about to happen, and you've got to make decisions because of the slow acceleration, because of the lack of engine power. You've got to make decisions and read the minimap long before something happens. So I made the right decision. I got out of there just in time. I mean, even by the time I got to the Abbey, I was spotted just as I got into cover. And if I'd left it 10, 15, 20 seconds longer than I needed to, if I'd hung around to take 1 or 2 more shots on that flank, I would have died. The enemy team would have caught me before I could get into cover. So, you know, you've got to basically look at the minimap, keep an eye on it, and basically keep in mind that your engine power is just so bad. However, you got to see the gun sniping at distance. It's accurate, even though it may not be the most accurate. It can still take out tanks at distance. It's rapid firing. The DPM, even though it may not be as good as most other tier 6 premium mediums, it's still very, very good. You got to see the armor. Didn't bounce very many shots, but did manage to bounce a T67 with my gun mantlet. You got to see me fighting for my life and being the last one standing, trying to keep distance to, you know, as I say, between myself and enemy tanks, but it just didn't work out. And that's the issue with this tank, and that's one of the biggest weaknesses. It's the fact it's so team dependent. Unlike the Cromwell B, where I would have been around the map, flanking, trying to do more, could have helped one flank, then gone and helped the other flank. With this tank, you spend more time just trying to keep distance between yourself and enemy tanks than you do actually trying to flank. So, you know, it's almost impossible to play this like a traditional medium. It's much more like a mobile tank destroyer, and it's incredibly team dependent, far more team dependent than the Cromwell B is. You need teammates to spot for you. You need teammates to tank damage for you. You can support them, but you need teammates that stay alive long enough for you to be able to play your game. And that just didn't happen in that game. So even though we did almost 2,000 damage in that game, ended up with 500 XP and a high caliber, it just wasn't enough. The tank is just far too team dependent, and that's that's about the only time I don't like playing this. I enjoy playing the AC4 in a platoon, actually, because in a platoon I know I've got teammates I can count on. I usually have better games in this tank when I'm platooned. But unfortunately, when playing solo, you are incredibly team dependent, and that's just a big weakness down to its engine. Okay, folks, time to sum up. If you're still sitting on the fence as to whether or not to get an AC4 experimental, I would say a lot of it depends on your playstyle, how you like to play World of Tanks. So we'll start with the strengths. It's got 60 kilometers an hour top speed, which is extremely good, but we'll get to that in a moment because the speed also happens to be a weakness. 60 kilometers an hour top speed, but mainly when you're going downhill. It's also got 20 kilometers an hour reverse speed, which is very good when you consider the next strength I'm going to mention is the gun depression. So what you can do is you can use its 10 degrees of gun depression, use hills, use rises in the ground, use your gun depression, get your gun on target, shoot, and then you can reverse with 20 kilometers an hour reverse speed back into safety very quickly. So the reverse speed combined with the 10 degrees of gun depression makes this a very good hill warrior. And when we talk about strengths of the tank, we also have to mention the gun because, you know, it's the typical British 17 pounder. The DPM is very good. It may not be as good as other tier 6 mediums, but it's still very good. It's not that much worse. The rate of fire is good, obviously, because the DPM is quite good, and the penetration is absolutely amazing because this is a 17 pounder that's a little bit iffy. You know, it's not a great gun when it's on a tier 7. It's not a great gun when it's on a tier 8, but on a tier 6 it can be quite good, and this is a gun with 171 millimeters of penetration that can pretty much deal with any tank it faces. You know, almost every single tank is going to be penned with 171 millimeters of penetration, with a couple of exceptions, and for those exceptions, maybe tier 8 heavies or well-angled tier 7s, then you've got 239 millimeters of penetration with your premium ammo. Another big strength. The premium ammo on this tank is extremely good. I think the alpha, even though sometimes when you hear people talk about 17 pounders, they talk about low alpha. the alpha is actually good. It's actually amongst the best alpha for a tier 6 medium tank, so I would consider the alpha a strength along with that amazing penetration. The aim time is also a strength on the tank, so the gun seems to have a lot of strengths, and that's before we even mention how good the soft stats for the gun are. The accuracy when turning on the move, or shooting on the move, the accuracy when turning your turret, they are better on this tank than they are on most other, if not all other tier 6 mediums. The camo rating is extremely good. It's got the best camo rating of any tier 6 medium in the game, and it's an exceptional, very, very good crew trainer, able to train your medium tank crews all the way from tier 1 to tier 10. And then, of course, there are the weaknesses. And the weakness, even though the gun is very, very good in almost every aspect, unfortunately, almost 0.4 accuracy means that the gun is extremely unreliable, extremely inconsistent. And in some games, it can be incredibly good, sniping cupolas from across the map, and in the next game, your shots aren't even going to reach the target. The accuracy is a big letdown. It was a big, big surprise because I was expecting the 17-pounder to be just like every other 17-pounder, but the accuracy is a negative for the tank, unfortunately. It's just underpowered. The horsepower to weight ratio is incredibly bad on the tank, and that means it's not very maneuverable. It's very, very slow to get into position, very, very slow to get out of position, very, very difficult to run away. And when this is a tank that needs to keep its distance between itself and enemy tanks, the engine power is going to let you down. You can get overrun, enemy tanks can catch up to you before you can run away. So engine power is a big, big negative, and surprisingly, even though the engine power, the horsepower to weight ratio are not very good on the tank, the ground resistance is also amongst the worst ground resistance of any tier 6 premium medium in the game. So the ground resistance doesn't help the tank either. So if you're thinking 11.44 horsepower to ton ratio isn't too bad, there are worse tanks, you've got to take the ground resistance into consideration. So that has a big, big aspect on how you play the tank and how the tank performs. It means that you're more reliant on your team in this tank than you are in, for example, a tank like the Cromwell B that can easily get into position, easily get out of position, run away, relocate and flank. You can't do any of that in this tank. This tank is all about keeping its distance between itself and the enemy, and the engine unfortunately will let you down. The signal range is quite poor for a tier 6, so on a bigger map at only 450 meters of signal range, you might find yourself losing contact with friendly tanks or enemy tanks on the minimap due to your poor signal range, especially if it's towards endgame on a bigger map. The view range is definitely not a strength. It's not a weakness, it's not a huge weakness, but it's definitely on the low side when it comes to view range compared to other tier 6 premium mediums. You really need to rely on teammates to spot targets for you, keep your distance, use your camo rating, and basically support and snipe. The armor is okay. As I say, a lot of people call the armor on this tank weak, but it's not weak when you put it into context compared against other tier 6 premium or other tier 6 mediums, let alone premiums. But one thing that is a weak spot or weakness for the tank that I discovered very, very quickly is just how poor the center mount is on the tank. The turret is central mounted, and that means when you're driving around corners or driving around rocks, you expose a huge amount of the front of your tank before you can actually get your gun on target. Same with the rear of the tank if you're reversing around a corner, and that means that sometimes you can be permatracked. You expose so much of your tank that enemy tanks can easily shoot you, track you, and you can't get your gun on target because the gun is so far back. And then the biggest weakness, or possibly the biggest weakness for the AC4 Experimental, is the fact it's not a Cromwell B. And that's one of the running jokes I had with platoon mates when I was playing games on this tank for the review. Whenever they asked me or talked to me and said, what's the next review or what tank are you playing at the moment, I'd say, I'm playing the not a Cromwell B. And they knew which tank I was playing immediately because they were able to say AC4. And it was a running joke. It's not a Cromwell B. And that is a weakness if you enjoy playing fast medium tanks. If you enjoy playing mediums, it's not a Cromwell B, and you're not going to like the AC4 Experimental. But I'm being unfair. If you hear people say it's not the Cromwell B, you're being unfair to the tank because they're two completely different animals. It's very, very hard to compare the Cromwell B to this tank because they both have different playstyles, they both have different strengths, they both have different weaknesses, and it's just not fair. If you prefer playing medium tanks, you're going to prefer to play the Cromwell B. If you prefer playing tank destroyers or support roles, you're going to prefer to play the AC4. The Cromwell is better at maneuvering, getting in and out of position, getting to the flank, getting to the rear of enemy tanks, and the AC4 is better at supporting. It's better at keeping its distance and sniping and supporting friendly tanks from distance, something that the Cromwell B doesn't do particularly well. The Cromwell B is not a very good sniper. Its penetration, it's got less penetration. It has a harder time dealing with higher tier tanks or armored tanks unless it can get to the side and rear. The Cromwell B can do that, whereas the AC4 can deal with heavily armored tanks or heavier armored tanks from the front, from distance, because the penetration on the gun is better. It's got better alpha than the Cromwell as well. It's better at shooting on the move. It's better with turret traverse than the Cromwell B is. So I think it's very, very unfair to basically compare it to the Cromwell B, because they're two very, very different tanks with two very, very different playstyles. This is all about its camo rating, its gun depression, and its penetration, and the Cromwell B is a very, very good medium tank if you like playing medium tanks, but you gotta play the Cromwell B aggressively and as a flanker to get the most out of it, whereas the AC4 can just sit back and pen tanks from the front. So, yeah, I think it's unfair to compare it to the Cromwell B, but I do think it's fair to compare it to the Sherman Firefly, because the Sherman Firefly is another tank, Tier 6 premium, or Tier 6 medium for the Brits, that uses the 17-pounder. As I say, the Firefly was the very reason this tank was never developed beyond prototype, because it was a tank that also used the 17-pounder. But if you've played the Sherman Firefly, you know, the maneuverability isn't particularly good, just like the AC4. The armor isn't particularly good, just like the AC4. It's got very, very similar armor, very, very similar mobility. And a problem for the Sherman Firefly is the fact it has absolutely, or well, very poor gun depression at only 6 degrees. And this tank has 10 degrees. And every time I play the Sherman Firefly, I wish it had more gun depression. Well, I got my wish, and that's the AC4. It's basically a Sherman Firefly that isn't as big a weakness. It's not as tall as the Sherman Firefly, therefore it can use its gun depression better. It's not as big a target, but it's got gun depression. It's got 10 degrees of gun depression compared to the Firefly. So I think possibly it's better than the Sherman Firefly in a lot of ways. You know, the Firefly has exactly the same problems getting into position, getting out of position, running away that the AC4 does. So yeah, when it comes to comparing it against the Sherman Firefly, AC4 is a better tank in my opinion. So essentially it comes down to this. If you are a player who prefers a slower paced game, who prefers to keep their distance, I don't mean camp the corner or camp the red line or never leave spawn, but if you prefer supporting friendly tanks, let them move forward, stay maybe 100, 150 meters behind them, then the AC4 is a good tank. If you prefer fast paced medium tank gameplay, then obviously the Cromwell B is going to suit you better, because the Cromwell B can have a far bigger impact on games. The AC4, another weakness is that is very, very team dependent compared to the Cromwell B. Cromwell B can move from one flank to the other very, very quickly if things are going badly or if the other flank needs support. That is something that the AC4 can't do. So if you are advancing and the tanks in front of you get overrun, you are probably going to die, because you cannot run away, you cannot relocate, and it means it's much more team dependent in the AC4 than you are in the Cromwell B. It's all down to your playstyle, guys. I'm not going to say that the AC4 is a bad tank. I've seen a lot of people give this tank bad reviews, but it's only a bad tank if you enjoy medium tank gameplay. If you prefer tank destroyer, and I know it's a crazy comparison, but this is more like a tank destroyer than a medium tank. It's got tank destroyer capabilities, but it's got a lot of strengths that tank destroyers don't have, which is fast turret traverse and amazing gun depression. So if you prefer tank destroyer gameplay, then I think that the AC4 is possibly better than the Cromwell B. I know, it's heresy, but Cromwell B, for medium tank players, you know, you're going to hate the AC4. The AC4 for tank destroyer players, you're going to hate the Cromwell B. So there you go, that's the best I can do, guys. I think it's worth it depending on how you play the game, depending on how patient you are, and depending on how much you love medium tanks, because if you like medium tanks, you're probably not going to like the AC4. If you like playing TDs, then you probably are going to like the AC4. So, you know, I can recommend it on that basis. My games in it were quite enjoyable when my team didn't collapse. I had a lot of good games in it, you know, and a lot of frustrating games in it as well, but I don't think it's a terrible tank, and it's really, really up to your own playstyle. So thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.